Storytelling Lane. Warning: this story is not suitable for children. For the ultimate experience, we recommend listening with headphones. Let the story fully immerse you. The Secret of the Red House. Bill and Anthony had not seen each other since graduation. After meeting at the train station, the two began their journey to the estate of the brothers Robert and Mark. The road wound through picturesque hills. Bill appeared more serious and thoughtful, while Anthony, slightly nervous about the upcoming gathering, couldn't take his eyes off the estate known as the Red House. The driveway was lined with tall beech trees, and the brick facade of the house gleamed in the afternoon sun. Anthony stepped out of the taxi, looking around with interest.
Well, I didn't think I'd set foot here again after all this time,
Bill said with a smile. They were greeted by Mark, Robert's younger brother, who led them to the lounge. The large estate was furnished in a classic style. Mahogany furniture, crystal chandeliers, and a roaring fireplace. Guests who had come for dinner were seated around the table, chatting merrily. Anthony entered, followed by Bill. They sat together, filled with joy and anticipation, but they couldn't help noticing the atmosphere was more tense than they had expected. That was when Anthony realized Robert was missing.
Mark, where is Robert?
In his study, I suppose. He'll be here any moment.
Dinner passed peacefully, but the tension in the room was palpable. Then Mark stood up and said,
"Excuse me, I have some work to attend to in the study."
The silence that followed his departure was deafening. Robert and Mark had locked themselves in the study, while the remaining guests moved to the lounge, where tea was served. Everyone began recounting how their lives had unfolded over the past years. Suddenly, a loud gunshot echoed. Everyone froze.
What was that?
One of the women exclaimed.
That came from the study,
Bill shouted, running toward it. When they reached the study, the door was locked from the inside.
Mark, Robert, open up,
Bill shouted, pounding on the door. There was no response.
We'll have to break it down,
Anthony said decisively. With combined effort, the two men broke down the door. The scene inside shocked them. Robert lay on the floor, shot in the chest. Mark was nowhere to be found. Chaos ensued. The women from the lounge rushed to the scene, but Bill and Anthony stopped them at the door.
No one is to enter,
Anthony said firmly. He carefully examined the room. Robert's body lay to the side of the desk, blood soaking into the carpet. On the floor next to him was a revolver.
This must be reported to the police immediately,
Bill said, pale-faced as he surveyed the scene. Anthony nodded.
and no one is to touch anything.
Bill rushed to the phone to make the call while Anthony stayed in the room, observing the details. On the desk were several documents, but none seemed significant. His gaze fell on the window, which was slightly ajar. When the police arrived, Inspector Birrell entered with a determined stride. He was a small man with a sharp gaze that missed nothing.
Anthony, isn't it?
The inspector asked.
Yes, and I'm ready to help in any way I can.
Then I'll need you to tell me everything you know.
Anthony recounted the events of the evening, mentioning the locked door and the slightly open window.
A locked room mystery, that makes this case interesting.
Inspector Birrell began questioning Bill and started taking notes.
Sir, when did you last see Robert alive?
I haven't seen him, but his brother said he went to the study. Then we heard the gunshot.
Was there any tension between them?
I think they had an argument, but I don't know any details.
Anthony, do you think Mark is capable of something like this?
I can't say for sure, but the fact that he's missing speaks volumes.
The other guests were then questioned. They all gave similar accounts to Bill's. None of them had seen or heard from Robert. The staff was next. The inspector started with the butler.
When was the last time you saw Robert alive?
I haven't seen him since last night. He told us he had an important meeting and asked not to be disturbed. He didn't say anything else.
The rest of the staff confirmed the butler's account. None had seen Robert since the previous evening. Then the butler approached the inspector and whispered that there were hidden cameras at the estate's entrance, which no one else on the staff knew about. The inspector motioned for the butler to follow him.
What are these cameras you mentioned?
Mr. Robert installed them secretly to monitor what happens in his absence. Only Mark and I knew about them.
I need to see those recordings.
Of course. Follow me, but no one else must know about this.
The butler led the inspector to a secret room. They played the recordings, but nothing unusual appeared. The footage aligned with everyone's statements.
Give me all recordings from the last few days.
Certainly.
The butler said, handing over a USB drive. Inspector Birrell returned to the study, examining the crime scene closely.
What do you think?
Anthony asked, standing beside him. Birrell smiled faintly.
I think we have a puzzle that will take time to solve.
The next day, after the autopsy was completed, the forensic pathologist determined that the victim had been killed the previous evening. Now the inspector had to discover who Robert had met with, which could mean Mark wasn't the killer, or that he might even be in danger. Late in the morning, the inspector's phone rang.
Inspector, the recordings from the previous night show a man entering the estate around midnight and leaving 20 minutes later.
Have you identified him?
Yes, it's Bill. He's also seen arriving the next day with Anthony.
That's interesting and it changes everything. Find me information about Bill. I want to know everything.
Later in the afternoon, as Anthony strolled through the gardens of the Red House, one of the officers approached him.
Mr. Anthony, we have new developments.
Anthony followed him to the back entrance, where Inspector Birrell was waiting.
Mr. Anthony, when you arrived, was your friend Bill already here?
Anthony thought for a moment and replied,
We had arranged to meet at the station and come here together. I don't understand what this has to do with the murder.
Did you know your friend Bill arrived the previous day? We found records showing he arrived earlier. We also found his train ticket with the earlier date.
No, he didn't mention anything like that. Why would he come earlier?
Anthony looked confused, and suddenly a dreadful thought crossed his mind. His face turned pale.
You're not suggesting that Bill is the killer?
There's a possibility. That's why I wanted to speak with you since he refuses to talk without his lawyer. We have evidence that he met with Robert the day before the murder.
This revelation shocked Anthony. Bill had been his friend since childhood. He couldn't believe he was capable of such a crime. The interrogation of Bill began as soon as his lawyer arrived. Birrell didn't want to waste any more time and started immediately.
Now that we're all here, let's begin. When did you arrive in town?
We arranged to meet, and I arrived shortly before Anthony at the station.
Bill said nervously.
And how do you explain this?
The inspector pulled out photos showing Bill arriving at the station a day earlier, along with a copy of his train ticket bearing the earlier date. Bill hesitated, glancing at his lawyer. The lawyer leaned in and advised him to remain silent. The inspector added,
You don't need to say anything. We have all the evidence showing how and when you murdered your friend. Now let me tell you what happened. You arrived in town a day earlier because you had a meeting with Robert. He had discovered the truth behind your so-called legitimate business, that you were laundering money for criminals, and he wanted to stop you. But during your meeting, you decided to kill him and stage it as a suicide. When you arrived the next day with the other guests, you waited for the right moment to play the recording of the gunshot. That moment came when Mark decided to go to the study. This was your plan to frame him. When he disappeared, it only helped your case. But what you didn't know was that the cameras at the estate's entrance captured you arriving at the exact time of the murder. Bill, you'll spend a long time in prison.
Bill broke down in tears, screaming.
You don't understand, he was going to ruin my life. I would have lost everything. I couldn't let that happen.
What you achieved was built with dirty money. You killed your friend, and still, you couldn't hide the truth. It always comes to light. Arrest him.
A police officer placed handcuffs on Bill and led him away. Anthony stood in stunned silence, his gaze filled with disappointment. He was horrified by what his friend had become. At that moment, Mark appeared. Anthony looked at him in surprise.
Where have you been?
I was hiding in the house. When I went to the study, I saw my brother lying dead. Then I heard the gunshot. I was terrified and realized someone was trying to frame me for my brother's murder. So I hid. But the inspector found me and told me they had caught the killer.
I was so excited about this class reunion. I wanted to see everyone and find out how their lives were unfolding. But what a tragedy it has turned into. My condolences, Mark.
Thanks a lot to everyone who stuck around until the end. It truly means a lot. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell, so you'll be the first to know when a new one is up.